Starting in the summer of 2007, of course, all of those three pillars of faith were smashed down very brutally in short order. It started, in effect, with a loss of faith in the ratings system. When we began to see that the rate of default in the subprime world was higher than the rating agencies had expected, people began to question that magical AAA label. And the realization dawned that actually the ratings agencies weren't such a good compass after all. Effectively, investors were tossed into a terrifying landscape where they had no compass to guide them through the maze. And so, as anyone who's ever been hiking in the woods in the fog will know, if you lose your compass and you don't know where you're going, you either panic and start running around in circles, or you just sit down and cry. And effectively, investors en masse in the shadow banking world sat down and cried, and the system froze up. And then, of course, we had a loss of faith in the banks. It became clear that the banks didn't actually know the value of the assets that they were holding on their own balance sheets, even though they had the flashing models, because guess what? The models didn't work. And one of the bitter ironies in the entire creed that underpinned so much of 21st century finance was that although all the innovation had been conducted in the name of promoting free market finance, people who worked in the credit derivatives world would sometimes talk about credit derivatives producing market completion. In reality, most of these products had never actually traded in free markets at all. There wasn't a market price for this stuff. It was founded on models, and the models weren't working, so the banks couldn't tell what the value of anything was, so no one could tell what the value of a bank was. So faith in the banks collapsed as well. And then, of course, faith collapsed in the ideas that the regulators knew what they were doing, and that the idea that innovation was automatically going to be good. Instead of spreading risk around the system and containing shocks, it now looked as if spreading risk around the system was actually amplifying contagion. It was increasing the sense of panic. And in a sense, the three ideals that had underpinned so much of 21st century society, the three ideals that underpinned Davos man, if you like, namely that globalization, innovation, and free market capitalism, the holy trinity I sometimes like to call them, the ideas that those were automatically good began to be questioned. Faith crumbled. Now, all through the period from the autumn of 2007 through to the autumn of 2008, when I talked to people about what they were making of this terrifying, disorientating landscape, one theme used to constantly crop up in conversations, which was that, well, at least we know there's one thing we can rely on, which is the US government won't let a big bank go down. And that was partly founded on what happened to Bear Stearns in the spring of 2008. And then, of course, fast forward to September 2008, and Lehman Brothers went down. And at a stroke, that last remaining pillar of faith, that last remaining item which had underpinned people's trust in the system, collapsed too. And then you had a period which, probably for many of you in the room, was sheer hell. But for me as an anthropologist was kind of fascinating as well. Because frankly, you can't imagine a better laboratory test tube case to see what happens if you get a financial system with no faith. If you had a credit world where no one actually appears to have credit in the narrow sense anymore. And essentially, people discovered that anyone who drank the Kool-Aid and believed that capital markets progress moved in a straight line, who believed that capital markets actually operated, was very, very vulnerable. It was akin, the image I sometimes use to explain to people who are non-bankers, to explain to them what happened in September and October 2008, was that it was a bit like a world where the internet and mobile phones suddenly stopped working completely, and there was no television too, and everyone was forced to go back to snail mail or walking around to talk to people. Most younger people can't imagine that, but that's kind of what happened in financial terms in the autumn of 2008. So what's happening now? Well, if you look back over the last 5 months, effectively, the government has stepped in to provide the new pillar of faith. In a world without faith, without credit, the government has offered one of the few underpinnings for the system. And it's done that in numerous ways that you're all very familiar with. It's taken stakes in the banks, it's taken over banks, underwritten massive amounts of bond issuance, guaranteed massive amounts of bond issuance, $400 billion worth at last count. It's stepped in effectively to replace the securitization market, It's injecting liquidity all over the place. And it's produced this dazzling array of programs to do that. I used to sometimes joke to my colleagues back in 2007 that the alphabet soup that marked out the credit worlds was so complicated it was hard to imagine that there could be anything more complicated than that alphabet soup. Well, now we know there is. There can be the government's alphabet soup of programs to deal with the alphabet soup. So we have kind of alphabet soup squared. And when you look at what the government's doing, or talk to them, I sometimes have the feeling it's a bit like me when I'm faced with my car that's broken down, which is that before the financial panic, we had a financial system, a machine that was so fantastically complicated that almost nobody actually understood how it worked. And now we have a financial system which is still very complicated, and many policymakers still struggle to understand how it actually operates. But they can see that it's belching black smoke and it's not really working and the gears aren't going round. So they're kind of twiddling all the dials they can find and kicking it hard, as I tend to do with a car, and sloshing on oil, i.e. liquidity, and trying to crank the machine itself, and then basically praying and hoping that that somehow starts to get the financial machine, the gears, turning again. If you look at that array of measures they're taking, essentially, as I said before, what it adds up to is the government stepping in to try to provide the new source of faith for the system, supposedly on a temporary basis. And of course, the question that everyone asks is will it work? Will it actually rebuild trust in the system? And will we actually start to see the recovery come in and the nightmare to be over? And what I'm often asked by people is, okay, so do you think it's going to be a V-shaped recovery, W-shaped recovery, U-shaped recovery? Where are we going? My best guess, for what it's worth, is that we're going to have a picture which goes down very sharply and then goes up a bit. And I think we're currently in a bounce upwards. On the one hand, we've had a real economy inventory bounce, if you like. We've had some stabilization in the financial system as people begin to trust the government will underpin the system for the time being. We've had also people beginning to realize that actually there is a flaw to their terror, a flaw to their fear, and suddenly shocks don't appear to be quite as shocking as they were before. But I personally don't think we're going to get a sharp bounce up again, a V, if you like. That's partly because of the sheer weight of deleveraging that's still to come, particularly in the American consumer side, partly because we've still got a lot of unemployment out there that's rising and dragging things down. We've also got the problem that essentially with the securitization machine broken, even though the government is stepping in to provide some replacement for that machine, it's not doing so on the scale that's going to get credit flowing again on anything like the degree that we've seen in recent years. And then, of course, we've got oil prices high and bond yields up, all of which I suspect is going to conspire to create a scenario that looks more like down, up a bit, and then flatlining for a while, at least for the next year or two. And it just so happens, for those of you who, I don't know whether anyone in the room has done Pitman shorthand. It's a skill that they used to teach journalists in the UK a few years ago. You're probably far too grand to have done anything like shorthand. But basically, if you look at the shape like that in Pitman shorthand, it just so happens that that spells out the letter bank. So I think it's true. I only saw it when I looked down at my notebook and saw this squiggle all over my notebook. So I think we're actually facing a bank-shaped recovery. Or bank-shaped thing. But the really interesting thing, and I'm just going to say a few words about this, is what happens after that. Because I think we come back to this issue of faith again. As I said, at the moment, faith in government is implicitly underpinning the system. It's not clear to me that that can go on indefinitely. Peter Peterson has already pointed out the unsustainability of a number of the debt trends. I'm not going to repeat what he said, except to note that I agree with him. One of my favourite little catches at the moment is I worked out recently that America's faced with what I like to call the 2020 problem, which is in the year 2020, at least 20% of budget receipts will be used to service a debt on current trends, and that's a very optimistic scenario. So it's not so much 2020 hindsight, it's 2020 foresight, and very scary.